Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is another episode of Crow's Nest, and this is the No Frauds Club's design podcast / update podcast. So I have with me, of course, another Crow, Veeq7. Raffle, how you doing? What's going on,
I'm
dude?
doing good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Had a good Christmas? Crowmas?
Yeah. It was pretty good.
Nice, yeah. Time with family, get to eat a lot of food. And it's one of the holidays that, I was about to say that everybody celebrates, but of course there's a group of Orthodox Christians, one of which is actually on the dev team, who has Christmas in the 7th of January. So that's actually going to be coming up. So we get to live vicariously through him and have Christmas again, which is a privilege afforded to a very select few people. So that's pretty cool. And so, yeah, we have a group of topics here. Obviously, it's been some distance since the last episode. The first topic that I came to you with when I was saying, hey, we should do an episode before the end of the year is I had been playing a bunch of games, right? As you like to do. If you're in the games industry, you like to play games. And unfortunately, a lot of the games don't let me play them. And that's why on my personal channel, there's a playlist called Just Let Me Play, because I wish games would do that, but they don't. They always try to stop me from playing. Yeah, they don't like to do that for whatever reason. So that's an issue that I've had to deal with. But one of the games I was playing lately was Halo Infinite's campaign. And it got me thinking that the characterization of everything in games is usually really bad. And so my concrete example would be any of the enemies that you fight. Like there's a little bit of banter and dialogue and stuff that the units or the enemies that you'll see will say when they're engaging with you or when they're trying to communicate. I don't know how complex the sort of internal decision tree is for what dialogue to say where or whatever. Like they respond to certain events, and I don't know if they're ever trying to specifically say some things when there's a certain other enemy in the area. Like does a grunt, who's like the small enemy, say something different if there's just another grunt in the area as the only other survivor, or if there's like an elite in the area or something. I don't know. I don't know how in depth that gets, but I always just end up hearing the same stuff. And it's not just repetitive dialogue or whatever, which does exist, but it's even if the dialogue is actually different in terms of the text that is said, that was written as a script line and then recorded by a voice actor, it basically is still the same thing. And what it got me thinking about was just because one of the enemies is literally called Brute, which is obviously a lot of the names in Halo are silly, but they're basically not ever allowed to be anything more than just a brute. And it's weird because actually in the campaign story, one of the enemies that you fight, they try to play around with the idea that he's more than just some idiot. But when you actually track the decisions that they make and how emotional and angry and basically stupid they are, you can't really take them seriously. You can't imagine that they actually built a giant fleet or salvaged it together or whatever they did, and that they're actually a threat to you and maybe extinguish humanity or something. They're too dumb.
I will just immediately break your immersion because you realize that those are just copy paste. They don't have character. They're all the Brutes are just the same generic archetype of a character design, and it's really you're playing a game when you see that. It's not an experience.
Right. It's not they don't really they're there because you start to think about why they're there, right? And why they're in front of you, why they're your enemy. And you just can't buy that they're actually part of the world the way that the game wants to present it to you. So you start thinking, oh, those guys are there because the developers needed to have enemies. Just thinking about it in those terms completely, like you say, destroys immersion because you're not thinking about in-universe justifications for things because there are none, or you can't buy the ones that are presented to you or whatever. So, it's kind of a weird topic because that's the thing that made me think about it. But I just feel there's an old trope. I forget which channel does this. It's a fairly popular channel that will go through tropes in, I think it's literally a series called Trope Talk. And I think they have something called Planet of the Hats or something. And the host says stuff about how she's read a lot of fiction or whatever. And they always have oh yeah, on this planet, everybody wears a funny hat. And that's supposed to be basically underscoring the idea that there's overly simplistic characterization where every part of a certain race is the same. And what they always miss when they do that is humans are really complicated people, and you go from one area to another area, and maybe there's enough overlap that we can all say that we're more similar than we are different. But there's still a lot different about us from, our culture, the rituals we do, or the things that we value and stuff. And obviously it's a source of a lot of discord, but it's also the source of a lot of really unique and interesting and compelling things where you can just explore within one race, in the case of the human race, like so many different things that might happen. And yet, whenever you see a lot of science fiction and fantasy races depicted in games specifically, but I'm sure it's also like the case in bad books and movies and stuff, they're just never that compelling. They're never that deep. It's just, yeah, here's a brute. And like, you know what a brute is because they're literally called brute and they just smash or whatever. And like, that's like the starter but like, what are the interesting divergences, right? And there's almost attempts to play around with that in the Halo games where I think there was in Halo Reach, there's like a class of enemy that you never fought in the campaign to my knowledge, but existed in the game and they were called Heretic, I think. Or something like that, maybe Vagrant or Heretic or something like that. And it was in a class of elite, which is supposed to be this like religious group, and they like fight with honor and stuff. And it's not a brute, but it's like a similar rank or whatever. And as a result of the fact that they're like fighting with honor, the group of heretics were the ones that used human weaponry instead of the Covenant weaponry. And it was like, oh, that's kind of an interesting idea because you imagine like in order to like actually leverage that, like you have some sort of predilection for using human technology, and that makes you different, even though you're still part of the same race. And they actually brand you differently. Like they give you this like profane rank or name or whatever, and they kind of look down on you or something. You can instantly imagine filling in the blanks, even though all that exists is like what they do in the game and a name for them. And it's like, that's all you need to like immediately start thinking about what's different.
That is sort of why show over tell is so important, because if you show some important details, the player can fill in the blanks, but when you just have an archetype and you don't try to show any details, the player will not try to imagine any interesting things. They will just look at it and like, oh, this guy likes to attack you.
Right.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and so something that's weird about Halo Infinite is that so many of the enemies will use human tech. Like, it's any enemy now. Like, there's some grunts that do it. There's some jackals, I think, that do it, or whatever. And, like, there's all the different enemy types of Halo. You don't really need to know all the specifics, but it's like, it went from, like, something that never happened in the campaign, but was included in, like, the game that you could specify to spawn in their repeated horde mode. And that was where I found heretics, and that was when I was started to think about that. And, like, that was really interesting because it was a rare case of that happening. And I think in maybe Halo 2, there was a case where brutes, I don't know if they were using human tech. They probably were, but they definitely had like an area where you could walk in and see that like it looked almost like brutes were examining the human technology because they had like human shotguns and stuff. And they were like, you imagine in your head, like, oh, they were probably like tinkering around with that and like seeing if they liked that better than some of the Covenant ones or whatever. And you can start to think like, oh, that's kind of interesting because like only some brutes might do that, or maybe all, but now it's like everybody does it. And it's not, it's no longer like a unique thing that makes it feel like
it's attention to details from the designers then, because like what something used to be unique and interesting, and now it's just like, oh, everybody does that. It's almost like the heretics use the human weapons by accident and not by design now.
Yeah, well, they were different developers because Reach was still Bungie, and then every Halo 4 onward was the in-house team. It's kind of weird because if the other game I tried to play, and again, I say that very deliberately, was Gears of War 4. That game ended much worse than Halo Infinite, which Halo Infinite did crash a few times, but Gears of War 4 froze, and the only way I could launch the game again was to restart my computer. So I restarted my computer and then uninstalled the game instead, which I think is probably the best way to do that, because I don't think I could have uninstalled it without restarting it either. It's one of those like attempt has been made to exit to access an exiting process. Anybody who's ever seen that error in their process hacker or task manager or whatever, they know that basically it was like a signal sent to a driver and then there was no finishing to the signal, so then it's just hanging, or like, it's really bad. Windows is bad, games are bad, but the software being bad on the other hand is like one thing. But like Gears of War was also a game, like that fourth Gears game, they had like kind of an interesting idea where they had this speech happen from a character who I didn't know about at all, and it was like supposed to be some political leader who was giving a speech, and then like they would have like these weird flashbacks to events where you played as like some nameless soldier, and that was a kind of a change in the first place, because usually you're not playing as nameless people, but like you're just playing as like whoever, and in these little like isolated episodic chunks of like 10 minutes of gameplay or whatever. But obviously the problem there is that it's just like a million cutscenes interspersed without, and then after that I'm thinking, okay, now the game will start, but instead I'm like running around with this clunky movement mechanics, and you're being told to like outrun a natural disaster or something. It was just, what is going on? Like, this isn't what I signed up for. And then I'm like fighting robots for like 30 minutes, and then the game crashes. So I was like, all right, well, easy. But like that's another case where it's like this development process of having these in-house developers, and you remove it from, obviously Epic Games is responsible for the early Gears of War games for people who don't know, and then like Microsoft just owns the rights to it, so they just pass it on to their own developer. I don't remember all the details for how that happened, but both Halo and Gears of War are in that state, and it feels like, I mean, people have said Halo Infinite's really bad for a number of reasons. Obviously, one of them being the microtransactions, and it looks like Gears of War offers in-app purchases as well these days, which is just calling your game an app. Come on, bro. But beyond all that, it's whatever. I just wanted to get it off my chest that it feels like characterization's really bad, and it's not even like the experience of playing the games is particularly good either. Like Halo Infinite felt really hollow in the campaign a lot of the time because they tried to make it open world, but it was literally just like you don't get any real value from rescuing a Marine squad from Covenant, or Banished as they were called in that game. And you don't really get any value from destroying a propaganda tower. It's just like some number in your progression system goes up and unlocks like new weapons for you to use or whatever. And your movement is way better. Like your ability to move around the map is way more than your fellow man. So it's not like you can bring them with you really, unless you want to take the really long way. I don't know. It just felt like it was super underbaked. And the fact that the characterization was so boring on top of it was like, for some reason, I zeroed in on that even more than the gameplay. It was like, really? Like, this is all you can do is tell me that there's a brute and he smashes stuff. And
yeah, I think that's an interesting realization because like every game nowadays is just very generic, and I think that's super reflected in the narrative and the like enemy design and everything. And it's just like you look at, I don't know, StarCraft 2, you have the Void, you have fucking Amon, you have like all the generic transmissions. It's all like, it's like super obviously scripted, and it doesn't have life to it. It's just incredibly bare bones. It doesn't have any depth. It has no details. It has no forethought, no planning, nothing. It's just generic. It's just like some group of people without much interplay, communication between each other. Like they just like, I guess, made some ideas that are super generic and they chose them randomly. Maybe, I don't know. I really don't understand why all the big games and even the smaller ones are so generic now. But it seems to like reflect every part of those games. Like you look at the code, you look at the design, you look at the writing, and it's all generic.
Yeah, it's very rare that you end up finding like, even like, sometimes the promise of what a game could be is now like, that's such a whack angle to say, oh, you should play these games because they could have been something good. Like, well, how about they just be something good? But you can't even really say that part anymore, because the stuff that could have been good has been optimized and like spreadsheeted to such an extreme degree where whatever the game is almost like a series of chores and fetch quests and stuff for you to do. And or like in the StarCraft 2 case, when Jonathan Blow was on most recently, I was talking to him about how like he described it as very condescending, which is actually a term I hadn't really I've used for like Half-Life, but I haven't used for RTS games. But it's the same kind of thing. It is true. It's like, here's some cases where the game is basically saying, your time isn't worth much, so just grind through this stuff or whatever, or like, you don't have to be good at the game. You know what I mean? You could just progress. And
they also don't really design an experience. They just serve you encounters. Like they spawn units in, and like they design things to happen at certain times, and it's like supposed to keep you engaged, like artificially or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there was a point where I started to realize that in Halo Infinite, a lot of the stuff was very evenly spaced out. And the stuff that was, farther away from each other, like as like tasks to do, would be like stuff that you could get there easier with a certain vehicle or whatever. And it felt kind of academic in that sense, where it's like, Well, every object should be about 300 meters away from each other, and that way that we maximize the amount of time that the player plays walking around the map. And it's like, okay, bro, like, or whatever the reason was for it, but that's sort of what it feels like, and it does feel hollow. It doesn't feel like an experience, like you were saying. It's like,
yeah, it doesn't allow you to express your playstyle or even like how you enjoy games. You will just are supposed to like, oh, you're supposed to look at the views and like appreciate them or whatever. Now that's the point of the moment now. And now you're supposed to fight this boss. Oh, and now you're supposed to do this puzzle. It's like it's scripted, it's artificial, it doesn't have much depth. The player is almost omitted. The decision doesn't matter. It's just supposed to serve you encounters.
yeah, I mean, the gunplay was varied enough, and there was like a there's a very large number of tools. Some of them were just like straight up upgrades. Like I never really bothered using some of the weapons because they were just bad. But I'm sure that there were some cases where you could use a combination. Like something that I thought of is that I know Halo has had the you can use two weapons thing for a long time, but at least for the campaign, it probably would have made sense for like a specific class of sidearm to be able to be equipped in addition to the two weapons. Like you could have two main weapons and then a sidearm or something like that would probably be better than having only two weapons, because then there's like this whole economy of like guns where you only really use it if you're super desperate and you just ran out of ammo and something else. And because you can only have two guns, you're also like really trying to have like one mid-range to long-range gun and then one short-range to mid-range gun. And you also have like these two different kinds of guns where it's like, I mean, there's more than this now, but for the most part, there's like guns that are effective against shields and guns that are effective against armor or HP. And it's like, I don't know, that feels really kind of hard countery or whatever, where you just want to make sure that you pop the shields of somebody. But your point about like sometimes you're doing a boss and then now it's time to do a puzzle is really embarrassing in Halo Infinite, because they just give you a button, you push the Z key, and it just tells you where to go. And it's like you gave up. Like you couldn't even make an environment where like stuff was intuitive, or you were like catering to a really low common denominator player who walked into an area. And partially because every game has trained them to do this now, they were looking for like a button to press to reveal the objective. You know what I mean? And so you just decided, instead of like, reaching out and extending the opportunity and the prospect of becoming better at reading the game and better at understanding what was intended, and then also like you as the developer respecting the player enough to make sure that like it was visible and it was meaningful and it was an interaction that was worthwhile, you just decide, well, there's this button they have to push, so they should push another button to reveal the button they have to push. It's like, I just don't even understand why that's in the game at all. Like, I would sooner remove the button that you push to reveal the button you have to push, and then also remove the button you have to push, and just make the event happen like automatically, instead of it being some chore that you have to like step through or whatever. It's like, that's the kind of stuff that makes it feel very much not a game, and very much more like I'm like checking boxes that some marketer put together in an Excel sheet or something. It feels way less like you're actually a part of the world and trying to explore that world. Like you were saying, oh, look at these beautiful visuals and this vista when you're walking around the map. But it's like, if that was actually rewarded, or if that was like meaningful and a part of the game, that would be one thing. But if it's just, I go to an area and instead of even seeing anything, I activate detective mode in Batman, or I push Z in Halo Infinite, and it just reveals what I need to reveal. That's not, like, then I'm not appreciating the visuals anyway, because there's all this ugly post-processing that gets onto the screen. And I'm also not really doing anything. I'm just like asking the game where to go. And anybody could do that. Like anybody could walk up to a button and push E. How about like, the interesting things about how to get to that button or whatever, like the gameplay decisions I have to make. I don't know. And enemies were very rarely aggressive.
I feel like the example of like beautiful view is that really shouldn't try, like they shouldn't try to force it. If the game looks good, then the player would automatically at some point probably find something beautiful or whatever. And if they are really in the game for the beautiful views, then they would probably decide themselves that they want to spend more time in that zone or whatever. And it wouldn't have to be like forced by like, oh, let's space this because, walking is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the area of Halo Infinite initially has some luster to it, although you start off in some really ugly environments. But like when you get to the actual open world area. It's kind of interesting. You get to see a lot of different, not really a lot of different biomes, but at least there's a lot of different set piece areas or whatever, where it's like, here's where a ship crashed and here's where a base was constructed and whatever. Like, here's a canyon. And then most of the time it's just like, grassland or whatever. So it's kind of one note, but at the very least, there's like some fidelity to the experience, and you get to see, there's a lot of like bugs that sap at the value of looking at it. But the biggest issue is that since you're mostly just walking around or like traversing an area because you can't fast travel there yet because you haven't gone there yet, it feels most of the time like you're just slowly slogging through stuff, and eventually you'll get to the point where you finally reach that area. So you don't really care enough to stop and look. You're just going to use your grappling hook to like fly around the map and bypass all of the time to actually look at stuff. And then you get to the area you're going in, and then it's like, all right, it's time to go somewhere else. So they actually, the way that the rest of the game was designed and the pacing and progression of the game stops you from ever wanting to stop and smell the flowers, as it were. And so all of the work that somebody put in to create a good looking environment just ends up going by the wayside for most players, especially when, most games these days, they don't really encourage you to stop and smell the flowers for any meaningful reason. And, if they do, they're just gonna basically say, here's your environment, blah, blah, blah. And so that feels pretty bad. But anyway, I think we've talked about Halo Infinite and similar games well enough. Something to mention for you if you're, I don't really have a corollary where like there's a game that does it really well or whatever, but it does feel like characterization, like one of the reasons why people don't take games seriously for story, I think, is because there is the subconscious feeling that the characterization of stuff is just dumb and you're just going through stuff very, very silly in nature. It's like, here's this enemy and here's this enemy faction and they're all the same in this faction and there's no diversity or no variability, no individuality. In fact, it's like you fighting one guy is about as good as fighting another guy, even though there's different kinds of enemies in the game too. It's like, you've got like, there's one brute that doesn't even have a weapon and just tries to beat you to death with his fists. And that's kind of interesting because he's at least aggressive, but there's never any follow-up usually. Like no enemies other than that are particularly aggressive and try to close distances. So it doesn't really feel like it ends up getting actualized anyway. So anyway, I just felt like ranting about that for a bit. It's something that, I didn't expect it to trigger me as much, but just walking through that and seeing like, here's a brute, he's a villain and he's a brute. And isn't that interesting? No, it's not. So would be nice if maybe there was a bit more depth. And even if like the enemies that you fought had a little bit more, I think a lot of that would come down to the way that they actually interact with you in the game. And most of them just feel the same, even if they have different weapons, because most of them have the same strategy. So that's probably another thing that even if in the writing, it's not very good or varied, but in the game, it's also like very much the same. Like the only one that's a standout is the one that actually tries to be aggressive. Most of them don't. So that's something that definitely could be improved in all of these games, is if enemies actually were trying to defeat you. But instead, you get these tutorials in Unreal Engine or whatever that say, hey, you should make sure that when there's an enemy behind the player, they don't shoot them. Or whatever. It's like, okay. Yeah, if there's more than 3 enemies on the screen, have 2 of them not shoot you. Yeah, that's a great tutorial. Thank you. It's like maybe that should just be expunged from the games industry entirely, and enemies should actually be threatening. Just an idea.
Yeah. And I feel like you would have a better tutorial by just failing in the game, right? Like,
yeah. That's
if you get shot in the back, then you remember to be careful and like maybe not go aggressively into open fields, maybe look around and stuff.
Well, most games don't really have much of a sound staging, which is unfortunate, because otherwise, like in Doom 2016 is a game I really noticed this in, when you'd be like, there's these gigantic demons and they make the smallest, most pitiful footsteps that just get drowned out in the sound mix, and they could be right behind you and you wouldn't know. So you definitely need to keep moving and keep looking around in that game, but it's not because of like, enemies being really intelligent with their positioning and trying to surround you, or trying to flank you necessarily. I'm sure there's some aspect where that does happen, but it's mostly because you can just get surprised by basically what feels like invisible damage happening to you because you couldn't possibly have heard stuff. So I feel like most games probably suffer from that. Right. Doom was just an extreme outlier because of how crunchy everything was and how loudness warred it was. But like, I think the same was definitely true in Halo Infinite. A lot of times I died, I was like, where did I die from and what killed me? Like, you just have no idea. So it's also the first Halo game that I've played, maybe the first ever, where when you die, you enter into a loading screen to get back to where you were. Every other Halo game would just like, you would die, and there'd be this length of time where you'd observe your corpse, which was probably to hide the loading times, but then you would reload immediately. And in this, you still have the length of time where you're looking at your corpse, and then you go into a loading screen.
You got a static image.
Yeah, the loading screen is just a static image, which is whatever. Yeah. They can stop the simulation of what's happening outside when they throw you into a static image. But the game should not feel like a downgrade, and Halo Infinite definitely did, in terms of, even though you have this open world thing, which is one technical marvel or whatever, but you also...
Well, it does definitely seem that it's a cash grab, because it doesn't, it has no attention to details. It has the in-app purchases, and it's just not well crafted at all. It's just oh, let's make a game for money.
I don't know. They try to distance themselves from Halo 5 by going to Infinite, which I thought was funny. There's a big bit of a gap between 5 and Infinity, guys, but whatever. So, you actually brought up something that I wouldn't mind spending a little bit of time on here, which was tutorialization, actually. Because we've been thinking about how we're going to do that. Right now, we are in the middle of working on our first game, and it is going to be an RTS game, which is not really linked to Halo Infinite in any capacity, but it's something that we want to take a look at in the context of tutorialization and onboarding and all this other stuff. We want to make sure that we're kind of designing the tech tree, obviously, from the ground up. We're thinking about it how do we make it so that and we'll talk about pacing as the main topic here, but tutorialization can kind of segue us into there pretty nicely, because we can talk about, here's the game, here's the tutorial, or what is the tutorial and player onboarding like. If the tech tree is welcoming enough, insofar as it's not intimidating in the early tier, then as you scale up the tech tree and get more options, you kind of are in a perpetual state of limit testing and understanding or expanding your understanding of the game, and expanding your knowledge base as you get into more and more situations that are kind of unique, or you haven't personally experienced them before, or whatever. And I feel like that natural limit testing, that natural exploration, as long as the game and the content within the game has that extension of saying, hey, you player can be better at this game if you try. And here's an environment where, it's the campaign or whatever. And so you don't have ladder anxiety. You're not going up against a real player, but it still has enemies that are going to try to actually win and try to defeat you. And, it's an opportunity for you to learn. It's an opportunity for you to improve. Actually having that be the raison d'etre of the game itself is really important. If that's the reason for it existing, then now we have an opportunity to really look at how a game can sort of allow, the whole game can kind of be that tutorial, instead of tutorials in games are just always bad, right? So how do we buck that trend? And so I don't know if you have any immediate thoughts on what you like to see differently.
From a perspective of a player that is better than an entry player, I feel tutorials, they are just always built with a lack of understanding of the game at all.
Okay.
Where they are made before the game is actually played, where it shows the very basic stuff, the first order consequences of the mechanics, to build an SCV you click Q or whatever, and they explain you the basics, or move your mouse to the edge of the screen to to do whatever, or units fight, and great.
You've never played a campaign before. You've never used a mouse and keyboard before. Here, let us show you how. Yeah. Lowest common denominator.
And they never really show an understanding of the game in the tutorials, nor really in the single player content. It's always detached from it, I feel like.
Well, that's definitely true. Yeah. Again, sort of thinking of, you don't really if I said to the average person, hey, the whole campaign is like a tutorial, they'd probably think, oh, that's horrible. Tutorials are terrible in games, so why would I want an entire campaign? But if you think about the best possible interpretation of that, the best possible version of that, it's the whole game, in order to beat the campaign, you need to be able to play to a high level. And so here's the experience that you have, right? Here's the set of tasks you must be able to complete. The bar of skill you have to deploy and you have to surpass is ever increasing as the campaign goes on.
Yeah.
And if that's true, right? And it's also still it doesn't have to be, 1-to-1 with the exact like balance patch or whatever. We've talked about this before too in the finish your game episode. It's like your campaign can have version differencing or whatever. But if the core skills that you're learning about like how to play an RTS well or whatever game it is, if you can get good enough in that sense, like it's just a meme at this point that nobody recommends that you play the campaigns in RTS games to prepare you for multiplayer. Besides maybe like it will introduce you to how the units work, but all of the map states are completely different. Like I remember thinking I played a game called Command and Conquer 3 Kane's Wrath as a kid on the console, believe it or not, as a console RTS. So that's an instant meme. But when I played this, it came with a version. Like the console version had a different secondary mode called Kane's Challenge. I think that's what it was called. And basically it was this series of challenges that were like, it was positioned as like, you're a hardcore gamer if you can beat these. And like, you're really good at the game. You have to be good at the game to beat these. And I did that. And then I played ladder and I instantly got fucking owned because that actually didn't prepare me at all. And it was all like these gimmick situations that were just like grinds or whatever.
You don't real problem solving in the campaigns at all.
Yeah.
They don't show you any processes to improve. They don't challenge you. They don't make you frustrated. And they should, because if they do, you actually can reflect on what went wrong and...
Well, they can make you frustrated if it's just a bunch of grind, though, right? So it's like the ways that they do, if there's any challenge in the sense that there's an obstacle between you and victory, that obstacle is not like reflective of the kind of obstacle you'll face in a real game.
Yeah.
So that's where it's like the understanding.
You don't really have much control over the grind, though. So as a player, you don't really learn from that at all.
Yes, yeah.
That the game is grindy. But if it's hard, you actually get to control that to some extent with just like trying different strategies, trying to improve mechanically and whatnot.
Yeah, well, that's why we're like avoiding difficulty levels is really good for this kind of thing, because you get this objective metric that you can gauge yourself against. It's like, all right, I was not good enough to beat mission 3 or even the first mission of all, which is like the most tutorial baby mission. I still couldn't beat that. What does that say about my skill level? It says that I need to improve, right? Like, obviously, like that's the main takeaway is I'm not good enough yet. But the yet is really important. Like, that's where it's like you can kind of construct an RTS map in a specific way where you've got like terrain advantage for the player, and they can easily get to a point where they can defend against superior numbers by building defenses in a certain area or whatever. So they can be low skill, but last a long time before they actually get owned, which means that gives them more time to build up an understanding of what strategies might work and where they need to improve. Is like, you know, oh, I lost because, you know, I couldn't build enough units to defend myself. Like they just feel like they have way more units than I do. And that gives them like a problem to solve. And they can upgrade their understanding of the game by thinking, all right, that means I need to expand more so I have more money. That means I need to have more production structure so I can build more units faster. Like all of these core things that are really important to playing an RTS to any level of skill when you're playing single player or multiplayer, like especially the multiplayer angle for most people, because most single player doesn't test these skills, right? And so that aspect is actually really important. And, you know, we can have these teachable moments in the campaign missions themselves that will basically act as the onboarding and act as the tutorial. Like, I don't think I think for the kind of games that we want to make, you can't really say that a basic tutorial of like how to use the mouse or whatever would really fit. Because the whole idea is, here's this genre of game, the RTS. And most people think of it as this mature old genre. Like a lot of games have come out within it. Even though I would just say, like, in general, games as a medium is super young, and like there are humans who have lived, who are still alive. Many humans are still alive right now that never even knew that a video game existed when they were young, right? Like it didn't exist when they were a kid or whatever. So they've like the entire lifespan of gaming is within one human's lifespan right now. So it's still very young. Like it's not like books or even, you know, movies, although movies are also fairly young, especially compared to the written word. And so like there's plenty of room for additional, you know, optimization, additional exploration and innovation and so on. And setting that to one side, when you think about the RTS genre, most people who are interested in the RTS are already like fairly skilled, right? And a lot of people are obsessed with the idea that they need to make it more accessible. But in doing so, they often remove what an RTS actually is. And it's the same idea that we had some time ago when we were talking about how micro missions, like they remove what an RTS is And so why would you include them in an RTS? Like, you're making a game that isn't an RTS when you're making a micro mission, right? It's like you're playing a game that isn't an RTS when you're playing one too. And I think the same thing is true for the case of like making the game more accessible with having worker automation, which we did a video on this channel. When you have like any sort of system that's like automatically making a decision for the player in that sense, it's like there's a gradient to when that makes sense and when it doesn't. But for the most part, you want to, whatever decisions your game is about, you don't want to automate those. You want those decisions to be made by the player and be interesting and contextual.
Yeah, and the decisions that add depth to the game you want to keep and not automate them, and the decisions that make the game shallow you would rather remove.
Probably, yeah.
That's
like
why,
there's some automation that makes sense.
We removed the supply mechanic,
yes,
right, because it was just a chore.
Well, yeah, like we didn't
really
feel like it was a value add, a net add. It wasn't even close to like even splitting even on that. Like it was just, oh, you blow this up and some shit that's completely on the outside of it can't be operated, you know, stuff like that. And you can kind of make that argument for text structures, but at least it's like usually not something you're building, you know, hundreds of or whatever. Like the degree to which it is a problem is significantly reduced when you're using the tech center example. And then you compare that to supply. It's like, yeah, you just have to build this stuff. It's like silos in Command and Conquer or whatever. It's just like, here's this chore you have to build. So, yeah, I'm not really a fan of that at all. And I think nobody has missed it, which is like, you know, you can have that. That's a flawed metric. Like you can have things that are not necessarily fun or whatever the term would be there, but are still meaningful. And like, I'm sure some people would say that like, some people, again, not the people that we're targeting necessarily, but some people would say that like microing my units is not fun. So can you automate that or remove that or whatever? And that would be a net negative, even if some people said it was fun. So I understand it's like a fallacious thing to say is like, oh yeah, this is a signal that it's a good thing. But it's like, I feel like we're honest enough with ourselves in the community that we have to say like, okay, this is bad because, or like this mechanic is bad versus this mechanic is skill testing and I'm bad. You know what I mean? Like we can make that determination. And I just feel like even when you're good at building supply, it's not really a good decision.
Player.
Yeah. You're not really doing anything. You know, you're just like staving off something.
It's just like you have to keep a mental timer in your head. That's all the skill that is tested, but it's not really that interesting. Like it doesn't have depth. It doesn't have decision. It doesn't have complexity.
The first depot or whatever, the first supply structure is impactful. And like the first couple or whatever, that's impactful. But after a certain point, it just becomes dumb. And you can get the same level of pacing, and we'll talk about pacing again. But you can get the same level of like whatever that pacing is by just having good costs, time and resource costs and resource yield rates.
I think
and stuff.
The biggest problem with supply is that it actually has no dichotomy to it. You always want more. It's not like you would ever intentionally want to be supplied. Outside of like early game where timings really, really matter, like you wouldn't ever decide to just get supplied block as a like correct, good decision that would benefit you in any way.
Well, yeah, there's like very niche cases where it's like Zerg in Brood War will move their overlords to the enemy base and then the Protoss will kill the fucking overlords with a Corsair or something. Like, but that's just because you want the scouting time and then you just accept that it's supply blocked. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm so glad I'm supply blocked, you know? It's more like there's like scouting or whatever, but that's like a very, very specific case, like one game. Like even in StarCraft 2, you don't ever really have that as like a thing that you're going to use your supply as an expendable resource or whatever for scouting as like a trade. Like you pretty much never want to do that. So yeah, I don't know. It's it definitely doesn't feel like we need to look back on that. We're really missing something as a result of that. It did help us expose that like the pacing needed to be adjusted. And yeah, I suppose we can talk about that. I don't think we've really covered this on this channel, but in our Brood War Total Conversion or whatever you want to call it, Cosmonarchy Brood War is what it's called. It's sort of a prototype of what we feel like the RTS genre will turn into under our guise. At least our RTS games are going to reflect this design very heavily. And we're learning a lot from the various experiments we've undergone. A lot of the ideas that we had but weren't able to test, we eventually were able to test it. Like we removed the unit sizes of StarCraft and replaced it with weapon armor penetration and just regular armor. And so you would get cases where like, here's a weapon that fires 4 projectiles. So each one of them is reduced by armor and has no armor pen. And so that's like what the Vulture has now. And so you get a similar breakpoint to like what you had before in Brood War, but it's much more understandable. And then if you ever have any buffs, like increase armor pen or reduce armor, like it's a lot more understandable to sort of understand what's happening. You move away from percentage reductions and you make things more consistent and so on. And so you end up getting a very, that's not the only change. Of course, there's been many, many other changes, a very different game than StarCraft, but it's allowed us to explore very different angles on like systemic things. And one of the things that we did more recently, but not supremely recently, I guess it's like some months ago, is we significantly changed the amount of Vespene gas you can get when harvesting, which is like the secondary resource that you can think of as a way to express how powerful your tech level is. And so you're spending it on expensive units that are powerful, or you're spending it on teching up and increasing your overall pool of choices throughout the game. And as a result of reducing the ability to easily access a lot of that, because we reduce the yield of each individual gas node, we now have a situation where it takes longer for you to get to tier 2 or get to a higher tier in general. And so you spend more time at an early tier. And this has been a point of some consternation where, obviously now it takes longer to get to tier 2. Games might end before you hit tier 2. So there's a lot of units that, for example, like the Phalanx, which is our name for the siege tank, are in a situation where it's like, okay, you don't see these as much, right? And they're kind of an iconic unit and people like them. Or like the Minotaur, our name for the battlecruiser. That's another case where it's like, oh, this unit's very iconic, but it's tier 3, so it takes a long time, and maybe I never get there in, 50% or 60% of my games or even more. And so that's something that we're sort of fine-tuning. We're kind of thinking about, like, it's obviously valuable.
I'll just add to the research thing is that we added an interesting dichotomy to how they work, because previously both minerals and Vespene really just meant scale of your economy, and both. The ratio would kind of tell which units you can build and which you cannot, but it was mostly linear and most bases had the same amounts. And now currently we added a lot of opportunity cost to Vespene, where this is now your minerals is still your scaling factor to your army, but Vespene is now your power factor, where you choose to expend it to express power either on units or in tech, and it allows you to make more interesting decisions. I think that part of the system is really good.
Yeah. So basically, to put a more concrete example down, it's a lot of gas in order to tech up as Terran, but you can choose to spend smaller amounts of that gas to get the Goliath, which is a powerful unit relative to other tier 1 units. So if you've chosen to go into Fulcrum Tech, our name for the factory, you can get Goliaths, and you can do so at the expense of delaying your tech up time. And if your opponent can hold against you, then they've maybe gotten an economic advantage. It's like another angle for that kind of thing to happen. And so it's kind of hard to quantify it because there's been so many changes, and it's very different than Brood War. So if people haven't played the mod or they haven't seen it, then it's really hard for them to probably grasp what we're talking about. But the end result of all of that is basically you get to decide, do I want to, harvest straight from the geyser, which you can do now, similar to a mineral field, or do I want to cap it? And capping it is expensive and takes time. And so do I want no gas for a certain amount of time, but then more gas per return than my opponent, who is not capping their geyser? Or do I want the lower yield, but I have the immediate injection of gas, right? And that's kind of interesting, as when you first set up an expansion, you can immediately start harvesting gas. You can start harvesting gas from the first frame of the game if you want to. There's all these things that you can do as part of your decision, and it's more interesting and more nuanced. Something that I've been doing lately is if I'm trying to finish a game at tier 1, I'll try to spike up my gas count by expanding a couple of times and instantly going for that gas without capping it at all, and then spending all the gas that I have as coming in on these tier 1 units that are more powerful. This would be Hydralisks or Goliaths, like I was saying earlier. And so you get this opportunity to expend that gas early as soon as you get it, or you can be more conservative, have a weaker army that maybe can't affect change on the map as much, but can still defend. And then you're playing this more conservative style where you're trying to bank gas so that you can tech up. And that ends up being, I think, very interesting. It sounds like it's just two things you're doing. You're either teching up or you're getting a bit more powerful army. But the way that actually unfolds as you make those decisions, and the point at which you decide to switch what you're doing, and the way that you switch it's very, very nuanced, very different. And, there's so many different ways that you can interact with that dichotomy, right? It's much more about we jokingly said earlier, trichotomy or whatever a long time ago now, instead of dichotomy, but it's even more than that. There's so many different things that you can do. And it's a bit overwhelming when you first start, but as you build an understanding of what it all means and what the rough yields are going to be, it really does let you make some very interesting decisions. And, you can almost get to that point where it's I just need to end the game now. I'm just going to keep going, and almost like an all-in type thing. And you're not going to cap your geysers and invest in the future. You're just going to keep harvesting directly. So it can be pretty interesting in that sense, where like, okay, I'm starting to get the advantage because I'm like driving him back or whatever. But then maybe the leftover army of powerful units can now defend against a tier 2 army, because again, defender's advantage is powerful enough that you can riposte a more powerful army if you play well and if you do your right thing. So you can it's not like, oh, I didn't kill the enemy at tier 1, so now I have to GG and leave. It's more like, I didn't kill my enemy at tier 1, so now I can pull back and play more defensively while they get to tier 2 and they like really actualize their tech, and now is the time I can cap my geysers and start getting that. So there is a push and pull to it, and I feel like it's not just this greedy or feast or famine type deal, which is what I was worried it was, and maybe it was in earlier versions of it. But I feel like it's gotten to a point where it's fairly well solid. And yeah, we've just been thinking about pacing a lot. It's not the end, right? Again, just like I was talking about earlier about games are super young as a medium. Like, this is not the solved final perfect game state. We are going to make more innovations, and we've observed some flaws and some things that we want to change. But it's definitely, I think you'd agree with this as well, Veeq, that it does feel like it is a step up from other RTS games in terms of the decisions that you get to make about resources. So
it's definitely more deep than other games. It's pretty satisfying comparatively.
And because workers are still so important, anything that you can do to harass workers from your opponent as well, it's like, it's not. You can still come back. Like, that part of Brood War is really important to me. I feel like it's more possible to come back now than it used to be, especially because we're usually playing team games. So even if one player gets hit hard, they can be like covered for by their team or whatever, or traded or something like that. So that probably helps it too. But it definitely feels like you just have more opportunities, and it's an exciting like direction to take things, because you get to make more interesting decisions about, like you were describing it as mineral factor or scaling factor versus power factor. It's the fact that you have those two things now instead of it always being scale, or like both mixed in or whatever, is actually really exciting. So I'm personally very interested in seeing where it goes, but I don't know if you want to talk about some of the misgivings or faults that you've seen in the current system, and what we can talk about what we plan to change.
What I really so there are a few things that I like don't really, or like would prefer different, where I would prefer, like, there are some really good things about the current solution that I want to preserve, but there are some other things that I'm sad that are now not as doable, where like I don't know if I'll be describing this well, but basically the tree of decisions is now much more limited currently. The pacing improved very much.
Yeah.
I guess it's a bit like we maybe have to like shift the tier 2 a bit early and tier 3 a bit later, but generally it's way better where we actually have early action, and that's really great. What I was a bit not so happy with is how the segmented tiers look like for Terran and Zerg, where they require a lot of upfront costs, and like where, like, maybe like you described previously, like maybe you would want to rush that siege tank or that paladin for some interesting strategy, but you now cannot, even though like you have to pay this steep price. And then another thing is that the building is now very easily snipeable, where it's like a globalized thing that you can lose. But anyways, I'm not really very concise with what I'm describing, but
it's all good.
The fact with tech tiers is that you cannot really facilitate compositions as interesting as it was possible before, where previously you could imagine very crazy compositions which you would be able to get to pretty fluently, and currently it seems a bit more artificial, where like you pretty much always want to make a composition out of the units of your current tier, and then you also have this transition period where like after you build your tier up structure, you have to like take a lot of time to like you basically discard most of your production from the earlier levels for Terrans at least. Is Zergis actually Finder? Is they only do tech? They have everything from Marvel. But for Terran, you basically like once you go to like tier 3, your barracks are only really useful for like shamans and clerics, for example. And if you have like 20 of them, you sort of don't really have much to do with them, if that makes sense. And then
I almost feel like that's kind of, you can't really escape that without some way of like, also like you basically would need to instantiate some way for every race to be able to upgrade every production facility into the next thing, which would feel kind of cheap to me at least.
Yeah, I agree. But it does, like, I do feel like it would be great if you were able to like peak the later tiers, basically. Like, you won't be able to use tier 2 at full efficiency on like 2 bases, really. But if you were able to just like get like one phalanx maverick push or something, I think that would be really cool, where you would be able to like you would still be able to invest in in tech, which is currently, especially for Terran, is like you have to express tech, you have to pay this steep price to access it, and then you also have this steep period of transition.
Yeah, I would describe the price to access it with, so for people who aren't following, like this is the biggest problem with this conversation is most people who are listening to this probably haven't played the mod, so I have to try to use vagaries. So you imagine you have a tech center, and that tech center is very expensive, and then after you build that tech center, you then have to build production that tech center unlocks, and I kind of I conflate those, I combine those, so that is the price of accessing, right? So I don't think of it as two separate things where you're talking about how like, oh, you kind of invalidate older production, which in the case of Terran isn't even true. You obviously get access to some add-ons that
you have add-ons,
you upgrade. So it's not that they become useless completely as soon as you hit the next tier. It is true that once you hit tier 3, your tier 1 stuff is less useful because there is no like, you basically would need to rely on interactions from tier 3 units, which we do have some that increase the values of tier 1 units. And that would be like the autocrat for Terran allows, like it's an armor rend thing. So weaker weapons in theory can now do more damage to higher tier enemy units. So that kind of thing would apply value retroactively. Like now your more spammable, more weak units can like theoretically do more damage, but it's very specific. And those units are also the tier 1 units are generally have less health than tier 3 units. So they probably just end up dying anyway. So it is a situation where it's like, it's probably very niche, in which cases like actually apply that value add. But there are some cases where that would be a thing. And that might be something to explore in the future with our own games, is like, if we are going to have tier 3 stuff and we assume that you're going to have tier 1 production still in the game, because you obviously existed at tier 1 before you got to tier 2 and then tier 3, then what does that look like? Like, how do we add value or like make it so that you can still find some value in a composition if you did build 20 barracks, right? 20 tier 1 structures. And that would come from like some sort of behavior or some sort of thing that you can do to like use that. But I also feel like it's kind of intentional that you would have less value from tier 1 stuff. And the decision to build 20 barracks to begin with, or 20 tier 1 production facilities, is like, that isn't necessarily a bad decision, but it's like harvesting gas without capping it. It's like you're investing more in the now and less in the future. And it's not to say you can't then later invest in the future or actualize that. It is to say, though, that you have a bunch of stuff lying around that maybe isn't as valuable. But you're not going to, like in the Terran case specifically, you're not going to build a bunch of add-ons that allow you to build this powerful healer unit that you were talking about earlier. You're not going to necessarily do that with every single structure you build. And so you probably can afford to lift those off and send them out to the map and scout with them or whatever, which is probably what you would end up doing, because we're not going to include a button that just deletes your unit for you, because that's really stupid. So in that situation, like, you could salvage it with the advanced worker. That's kind of I feel like that's kind of a cop-out, because it's like, oh yeah, I have all this stuff that isn't useful. Instead of finding a way to make it useful, you're just saying, oh, I'll just delete it, So it's not really solving the problem, but that is one thing you could do if you wanted the money back. But even then, it's like they're fairly cheap. They're not really that important in the sense of like, oh, it's really important that I get my money back for this. I kind of feel like the tier 1 structures being expendable in that sense once you hit tier 3. I don't think you can escape that, like I was saying earlier. I also don't know if you would want to. Like, it almost feels like it would make more sense, that you do have that, right? Like Zerg don't have that. Protoss don't have that to another extent either, because they can kind of they pay a specialization cost. They don't have tech requirements. But Terran have liftoff, and their add-ons have self-destruct button.
The thing with what you just heard, like the power stuff, your power dynamic, I think that makes sense. I think the thing that more concerns me is like the conceptual stuff where like we try for every unit to be pretty unique. We make them have a particular playstyle. And it feels like at some point, like if you really like the playstyle of a Maverick, like for example.
Yeah.
And like you want to be mobile and you want to go this 1 sec.
And for those who don't know, Mavericks are Marines, so that's like your most basic tier 1 infantry unit is what Veeq is referencing here.
Okay, so if you really like the concept of a Maverick or really any unit, you don't get to facilitate it later, because like we specifically try to not repeat ourselves in the designs where we won't have Stimpak on 2 units, for example, right?
Right, yeah.
And the fact that how we set up tiers sort of disallows that from happening, because Maverick power dynamic is really going downhill later. It's not, you can't really augment them very, very much. You can't really, like, it just feels like there's a playstyle that is being killed by the way the things are set up, even though there's like this dynamic that could be facilitated by the design. I don't know if you agree at all.
Well, in the specific case, because we have a unit called the Apostle, which allows you to revive your units after death, that is a case where I could see, okay, you've got a weaker unit that dies more often, but has Stimpak, and you really like Stimpak, which increases your speed at the cost of health. Okay, well, how about, you mix and match those concepts, right? Apostle's tier 2, so you hit tier 2, you augment that. Obviously, at tier 3, you get the Autocrat, which does the armor pen thing, so you augment them that way. It feels like maybe you can, but again, this is a very specific example, and maybe we haven't really tested that exact composition, so we don't even know how effective it would be, how much of a scaling it would be. It still feels like it probably would be. This is like a placeholder or like a stopgap to keep using Mavericks while I upgrade my production so that I can use the other units that are
like
better, right?
It's just a bootstrap unit, not really a real unit. But since we made the early game longer, it's a bit fixed by that. But like, it's a bit better now. But
yeah, I don't know if I feel like the players who really like the playstyle of the Maverick will be incentivized to keep games at a tier 1 level or keep games at a tier 2 level so that their Mavericks can still find some use. Like if they get to the point where
then you don't
outscaled,
you don't get to compose them with some of the other concepts that you may like, right? Like the ones that facilitate your playstyle and whatnot.
Well, I'm kind of confused about what you mean by that, because if your playstyle is you really like a tier 1 unit, then how would...
So,
I'm not sure how you would give me a concrete example of what you're describing.
So if you have a tier unit concept that you really like, and then you have a tier 2 concept that you really like, and they like work well with each other, then you have like tier 3 concept, then you can't really like stay on tier 1, because you can't really use that combo on tier 1, and on tier 3 that combo is no longer really efficient, is what I was trying to say.
Well, we could either attack that by making the tier 1 concept, when augmented with all of the other stuff, still efficient and competitive, at least against some other compositions. Like, we could do that, and maybe to some extent we do have that still in the current model of the mod. But
yeah, I think the Terran infantry is actually pretty solid here, but
vultures are evergreen because of the spider mines. Everybody wants those. Like, it's really, really good. Even at tier 3, it's really good because detection is not ubiquitous, not as ubiquitous as default StarCraft. So you kind of have to deliberately, intentionally tech into it. anyway, there's many specific examples you can go for, but some units are also designed to be more like a power spike unit, right? Like Goliaths will still scale for tier 1 and tier 2, but around the time that the end game of tier 2 starts kicking in, and you get like a lot of I don't know, like cataphracts or like a big army of like apostle fueled units that just revive after death and stuff, like Goliaths are going to not have the crowd control and DPS necessary to like out damage that. They're more for like being the big dogs at the early game. And I feel like that's very valuable. I feel like the value of them doesn't, like in my mind, they are not a worse concept or a worse design because they get outscaled. Like the fact that they get outscaled actually makes the value, like it is part of why it is a satisfying design to have power in a moment and then know that you need to go past that. And so your example of a player really liking a composition of units, I think we can still support that, where if they really want to make a certain unit work and we have tools allowing that, then like we can design for that or we can approach that. And that's probably fine. Like that probably can be done. But I also think that we shouldn't shy away from units that we intentionally design to have a cap of what point they are useful and what point they fall off.
I do think having a unit like I guess Goliath wasn't your example, but having a unit that is intentionally a tempo unit that is really good at some stage of the game is generally a good addition. But I don't think you would agree that it would be the only archetype of a unit that you want to design. So.
Like some things, we're not really revealing too many details about our first game yet, but one of the things that we have in there is a unit that, I guess I'm fine saying it's a unit that you like kind of acts as a mobile garrison, like you think of the bunker, but if it was mobile, but it only fits one unit. You can only put one unit in it. And it has a weapon by default. So it's like you sort of like force multiply it, but only if the unit occupies only one space. Like there's some heavier units in the game, right? So only some units can actually enter into this. And only, units with a ranged weapon probably are going to be able to find any use out of that because they can fire while the other unit is moving. So you can almost think of it as like a passenger in a some sort of vehicle or whatever, right? That's sort of like how I would describe it. And that unit, okay, it's a tier 1 unit. So now if you imagine slotting that into Terran, okay, my Marine or Maverick or whatever you want to call it is able to be put into there. But also at tier 2, you get access to a unit that is the same transport cost of one spot. So it can jump into this unit. But so basically this unit, which is at tier 1, can be recontextualized into being additionally useful when you get access to other units at a later tier that can also interact with it, right? It's like a very easy, concrete example for everybody to understand is like, the bunker is useful at tier 1 because you can put tier 1 infantry in it. It might be more useful at tier 2 because you can put tier 2 infantry in it, right? Like everybody could probably understand that. It's like if you have more powerful infantry in the bunker, then the bunker is more powerful because its power scales with the units that are inside of it. So if we imagine something like that, but for a unit, then that's a case where
I can imagine like an example of like, you can put an Acantor there or something. I think the only problem I would see in using that strategy is that you would probably just die because the tier 1 units are usually very squishy compared to like the higher tiers. Like if you just compare, like if you just stage them against each other, the tier 1 units would quickly disappear.
Usually the cost efficiency of a unit goes up the higher tier it has, right? So, or it might be substantially like context specific if it's a unit that like if you kite well with it or whatever, right? It has more power or lasts longer, obviously. But the reason why I was giving the example of the unit that has the garrisonable slot is that's like a specific example where in one particular way you can imagine that unit being like more useful. But you can also imagine a unit later, maybe a tier 3 unit, for example, or something that like emits a healing pulse, but they cost one space. So you can repurpose your unit that was previously used for like putting an attacker in there. Now you can take this like slow moving healer and put it in there. I don't know, like that's just an idea. It's not actually a unit that we plan necessarily, but like you can imagine now like there's ways that I can augment this tier 1 unit concept. And maybe there's going to be a tier 2 unit concept that fits more units, but moves slower. And so it's not as like it's geared towards harassment, but it's like another version of the same concept almost. And as a result of me having that unit, I can add value to a tier 1 unit because now I can put a lot of them in that or whatever. I don't know. Like, so it doesn't have to be that it's like your specific counter to that specific example was saying, hey, there's like, that unit might die. But if it's like still useful in some other capacity, like maybe it moves faster than the unit that's inside of it, and so it's like a way to quickly ferry units around, then that would be one example of where it's still useful even at a later tier, even if it's maybe APM intensive to do that. The other thing is there might be a unit that increases durability, right? Or like does the healing pulse or whatever. And so you could still imagine like later tiers recontextualizing earlier tiers. And honestly, I feel like that's how the game should be anyway. Like, synergy between compositions being dependent on the units that are in that composition and also how well the player uses them. That's like one of the most compelling things about an RTS, right?
Yeah,
like if that wasn't true, people would just like they would just spam one unit and be happy with that, right? But like obviously people like it when they combine multiple things in it.
I think efficiently accessing all your tech instead of just the newest tier is like a really big thing that I want to push for.
Yes.
And in general, I think it's important to reflect on what we discussed on the stream, that we are in this for the long term, right? So we have to. It's good for us to consider like what we do and what is like the opposite, and like I think it's really important for us to have that in our process to really see that, because if we try one approach now and it doesn't work, we can try another one later, right?
Oh yeah.
And I think it's really good that we have discussions like this, because we can just like maybe not unsure, but we can increase the odds that we will make a greater game because of discussions like this, right?
Well, it would be the easier thing to just say, oh, what we have right now is good enough, or even lie to ourselves and say, oh, what we have right now is perfect. But why would we do that when we can just make something better with a little bit more effort? Like it's not, maybe it slows down the rate of the games coming out because we do this iterative process, but like I would rather have, 5 really good games on my resume, so to speak, under my belt than 10 games that weren't that good or whatever, whatever the conversion rate is. And honestly, like it probably wouldn't be that much of a difference either. So like it would probably be more like, 5 really good games versus 7 not so.
And then there's also the compounding effect, since we like the design sort of accumulates, because not only we build our process, we also like discover the like the important stuff and whatever. So like if we make 2 RTS games, the second game will probably be better than the first one, and so on, right? So
well, yeah, I mean,
very good.
We want to explore new angles a lot of the time, but it's also very heavily informed by what we've done since then, right? Like we wouldn't have a game that has upgrades, for example, or supply, because we have already removed that in previous games and found that it's been an improvement to remove that and replace it with something else. In the case of upgrades, it was just having more defined tiers with more options, deeper tech tree and supply. It was like, that's where the pacing changes came in, where it's like, instead of relying on supply to gate pacing, you just have appropriately paced tech trees, right? So yeah, I definitely think that that's good. The other thing too, to mention, in line with our second episode, Finish Your Game, is when we release a game, like we're not going to reinvent it the same way that we're doing so many different reinvention passes on the Cosmonarchy Brood War mod, where we're changing so many systems, we're experimenting and doing all these wacky things. And like, because we did that, it has equipped us with a lot of experience and a lot of test cases to draw upon and a lot of things to say, hey, like we know that didn't work in this context. So if we're going to try to make it work again, then we have to change the context. Or, hey, we know it worked in this context. So if we feel like it's not working now, then maybe we can try to make the context similar, or whatever. We have like all of this experience to draw upon, right? And it's definitely equipped us for better stuff, which means when we release a game, we're not going to go through the reinvention process. We're going to say, here's our game. This is what it's like. And, to the extent that we can improve what it already is rather than shift the paradigm, we will do that with updates and patches and stuff. But we're certainly not going to dramatically change stuff. Like the whole point of releasing it is to say that, hey, this could be done, right?
I think you don't have to worry that we will ever flip the game on its head like Riot Games. So
or Blizzard or any of the other developers. I mean, that's one of the main lessons I learned from Brood War. Yeah. If we do a good enough job to begin with, then we don't need to flip the game on its head. But also, like, we're not really interested. Like, we're not going to have microtransactions. We're not really interested in like a live service type deal. Like, we hope that the game is that we first release is successful enough to pay our bills and to do all this other stuff, right? Because that just means that we can more comfortably work on the next game, and also more continue to support.
Yeah,
what
we would
the
want.
other game or whatever.
We definitely want the games to be like. Ideally, they would be like self-hosted, where they wouldn't like require a lot of attention to like them even like running the servers. Hopefully, they can run forever and whatever. And then we also want to be self-sufficient ourselves, but outside of that, we don't need to be excessive like the companies.
We don't need to rely on like there's not really an incentive for us to keep overhauling and re-engineering an existing game, is basically the point I wanted to make. Is like, one of the reasons why Riot Games and Blizzard will never finish their games is because they have to keep adding microtransactions so that they can keep getting money. And so that necessarily means that they keep changing
But they
stuff.
actually never fix the flaws in the games.
Yeah. Like, what they re-engineer doesn't usually attack fundamental underpinning issues, right? And so, like, I think, to some extent, it's a good thing that they wouldn't do that or whatever. Like, I wouldn't argue that they should overhaul their game to fix fundamental issues. I would argue they should make a new game, but they would never do that, because that would split their player base across, multiple games that are in similar enough of a genre.
What Blizzard does, they just close the game, the original game, and
then they remaster it.
Yeah.
Imagine paying $20, or imagine not
they
paying
do it
$20.
again. They did it again with like Overwatch, I think.
Yeah, well, they did close or they're attempting to shut down the early one or something. I haven't really been keeping up with that, to be fair, but
yeah, I don't really care. It's terrible.
The first game was bad. The second game, I don't have faith in them making another any improvements or whatever. But I'll leave that for the people who think that it's good. So
they balance the game by forcing you to pick a role. So you have to have like 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 2 damage dealers, I think, or something.
I think now it's a 5v5 game instead of 6v6 in the second game. So who knows? But yeah, I did hear about role lock.
It's really bad. It's big, large design. So
who would have guessed?
Away. Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I think that any sort of final lessons here, I guess, on the topic of the pacing in RTS games is that I guess we didn't really cover the fact that, like, one of the main things that we felt in the older model. So one of the things you had said earlier is that the new model, you can't really mix and match a bunch of different compositions from a bunch of different tiers. And so we talked about many ways that might be improved in the future, and maybe in some ways that you can do it even right now. But one of the main things is, like, the problems of the earlier version were that you could pretty much simultaneously expand, tech up, and attack, or get enough of an army to attack, all at the same time by before 10 minutes, right?
There wasn't also that much action. There wasn't really that much incentive to
remain at tier 1, right?
Yeah, and nor was there an incentive to really take map control or whatever, because like you just tier up and like you just like go to the extreme stuff and you win and stuff. Like, it was just really quick, and I didn't really like you didn't have enough room to express your skill in that sense, where it would just end too quickly.
Yeah. The timings at which point you could express skill were very early, right? It's like
very short.
Yeah. So it definitely felt like it was too quick to, like, the action. You say there wasn't much action, but it's like the decisions made that were really important were all in the early game. And so you skipped over the early game, right?
You were like stepping on thin ice, right? Because like you do a mistake and your window of opportunity closes and you don't really.
Well, yeah, and the number of choices that we had in the early game was so high as well. It wasn't just that you could tech up super easy. You also had, I think it was like 20 units or something in the early game, or maybe it was like closer to 16 at tier 1 or something like that. There's some very high number of units that you could train.
Yeah, and people could just, I mean, this is still sort of true, but people could just like rush flyers and like sometimes they would make very important tech decisions before you can even scout them.
Yeah.
So that was a big problem, I think.
Whereas now, like, I think you have enough versatility that when you do scout them, and if you do see some cheesy thing, you can respond to it. Like, it's not that it's harder to pull off cheese. I guess it probably is, but it's like if you pull off the cheese, you are more skilled at it or whatever. Like your enemy made a series of mistakes to lose to cheese instead of like it was really easy before. Like it's not just I didn't scout for Escatumesk expanding in my fucking base with a hatchery or whatever. It's not just that. It's like you didn't scout them at all or like for the first 3 minutes or whatever. And when you did scout them, like in addition to that, you blind built like stuff that can't attack air or can't respond to the certain threat that is posed by it, whatever. You know, like a lot had to go wrong basically for you to actually outright die. And so that's like equivalent. But back in the day, it was like it wasn't the same thing, but it was almost as bad as losing the game in Champ Select or something, where like somebody would just pick a certain strategy that defeats you without you even knowing. Right? There wasn't any skill in that what they did, and there wasn't any skill in what you did. And so it felt very unfortunate.
I should probably run on Champion Select.
Yeah, why not?
It's such a terrible thing. I don't know. Like the fact that they like I will use the Riot Games example of League of Legends because that's probably what I'm most familiar with.
Sure.
But the fact that how it goes is just so retarded. Like they allow you to ban champions where it's just like the game is not very balanced, and in a balanced game, you wouldn't have to have that system at all. Like you wouldn't need to ban stuff. Like basically stealing an opportunity from an enemy player because like arbitrarily you said so. And then there's also the problem that the game is literally designed by counters, which is really bad. You have matchups like you said. So if you counterpick, you can counterpick the enemy. So if your pick order just randomly happens to be not like you happen to be before your enemy, he can counterpick you. Yep. So you can lose the game because of it. And it's I feel like if you would want Champ Select, I don't even feel like there should be gameplay that is happening before the game, if that makes sense.
And really impactful decisions. Like the RTS equivalent is just picking races, but like that's different. Sure. If you're actually a specialist that you can a good enough player that you can play each race. Like I always ran for that,
not tools, right?
In
RTS. But the fact is, like the thing is that I think you could solve this problem of counter pick. I mean, you obviously solve it by having good design, but I feel like you would probably want to have simultaneous pick order where like the player one of each team picks the race or whatever, and they don't see it until they actually both pick. If that makes sense. I don't remember
after you both lock in, it reveals the selection. Yeah.
I think that would be way better.
Within the flawed system they have, it might actually be.
But I still feel like if you can avoid it, you would rather not have it, and also you wouldn't want to have like runs and masteries or whatever.
Yeah, the out of game customization is just adds so much variance that makes it very confusing. I guess they started to move away from that when they removed runes and made masteries runes, or did they do the opposite? They removed one thing and renamed it to the other.
Runes, but renamed masteries to runes.
Jesus Christ. Because they had to make it as confusing as possible.
Yes.
What the hell? Yeah, like if you're a returning player for that game and you haven't played in a few seasons, like why would you even go back? It's so different. That's another thing that like you just we never have to worry about that because we're just going to make a game, release the game after we make sure it's good. And then, whatever changes we make will be very minor, ideally. And we aren't going to completely shift the whole game on its head. And so when you play the game first, you can say, wow, that was a good game. And you can come, I hope you continue playing it and enjoying it. But if you come back to it a year later, it's still the same good game, So you don't have to worry about the whole thing being different now. This is very silly. I don't know why that's a thing.
Don't do flavor of the month updates, please.
But you know what kind of updates we can do? Antikythera.
Antikythera.
Fuck yeah. So obviously it's been some time since the last episode. And as we wrap up, we can talk a little bit about what we've been doing. Like I said earlier, we're building a game. A lot of that is conceptual stuff, a little bit of art stuff. But we've also been working on the engine. Veeq specifically has been working on the engine. We did some from memory, and you can tell me if I'm missing anything. I know we did a bunch of Fog of War things, and that's not yet finished. We continue to work with pathfinding, A-Star. We continue. I think you did a bunch of like optimizations and stuff.
Yeah, I optimized it a bit. Used the heap for those ones.
Right. Yeah, that was when you were doing that.
Then I slowly started implementing jump point search, which is an optimization to A-Star. It shortens the time by like 10 times, so it was pretty good.
Yeah. You were experimenting with some other version of jump point that was like 100 times faster, but it required some extra pre-processing stuff that we couldn't do or something, right?
That one I only read. The normal one I am slowly implementing. I had some bug with it, so it's not finished. But
gotcha.
I did some really weird paths. There's something I had to misread or something. Anyways, that is something that has happened. There's shader hot loading. You can now write GPU code, and the game will instantly load it and reload it, and you will instantly see changes on screen. Pretty cool for developing stuff. For Fog of War, I have made it. I fixed the bugs. It's now a bit of a different system. Previously, it was layering the alpha, which caused some bugs. Currently, it's fully opaque image that is later blurred. The blur is currently the limiting factor because it's actually pretty slow to blur with a higher density of pixels. At least as far as I export, there's probably some way of optimizing it, but I'm using like the basic Gaussian blur, which like samples a few pixels and it generates an average. But yeah, that's something that happens for Fog of War. I still haven't figured out how to do correct height for the visible Fog of War. For those that don't know, currently in Antikythera, the Fog of War is divided into parts. There's gameplay Fog of War, which is like on tile by tile basis, and then there's visual Fog of War, which is basically a texture that is being rendered to, which shows the visual stuff. And I sort of have to make that texture reflect the heights, and it also should ideally reflect like line of sight of units. But that I have literally zero idea how to do yet. But yeah, that's something I was updated.
Right, yeah. Still exploratory at that point, but we'll eventually strap that in and figure it out.
Yeah, I wrote some prototypes for AI, but it's nothing working yet, workable yet, whatever. And then basically there was some so I started on networking stuff, but it's not really physical yet, I would say. It's mostly like mental work about it. So yeah, that's something that I'm doing.
Pseudocode, but in the brain. Yeah. Neurocode, as it were.
Neurocode.
Yeah, and on the game development side, like I said, we've been doing conceptual stuff. I think the first race pretty much has its tier 2 done. Tier 1 and tier 2 are pretty much done conceptually. And we're only planning 3 tiers right now for each race, and we're only planning 3 races. So we're almost 1/3 of the way there conceptually to a completed tech tree concept. Obviously, that's far and away from a finished thing, but it's what will allow us to do prototyping for the data entry and all that. So it does mean that we're going to try to get a prototype running pretty soon. Ideally, that prototype will have all of the first 2 tiers of the first race, and then that'll be by the end of January. And then our goal for February is to finish the first 2 tiers of a second race. And, obviously we need to continue working with art and stuff. There was this amusing thing I saw. I think it was a Corridor Digital video where they had some version of a special effects shot. And in big letters over it, it said, "Not legal audio." And that's kind of how I feel about our game, is that or our engine before, back in the Onatar days, we made a few cases where we were showing some update videos, and we talked about how a lot of this stuff is ripped assets from other environments. That's been cleaned out, so we don't have anything like that. But we might as well have just plastered over those videos, "Not legal video," because it was not or not legal graphics, I guess, because a lot of the graphics were from other sources. So we still have to do that for tiles. We don't have that, but we only have assets that we made ourselves or have permission to edit and sell as a retail environment. So that's obviously really exciting.
I think the assets that we have are pretty great conceptually. The execution of the art will adaptively improve over time. It's currently like I don't know how to describe it. So some of it is really good and some of it is really bad, you could say. And I'm definitely seeing progress in the art department. It's more certain now, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I rendered out the first race's first worker, so that was exciting.
Yeah.
It's also like for people who don't know, scale of an RTS is really important, like scale of assets. We want to make it so that it's somewhat believable that like, oh, a building could house this unit or train this unit or assemble it or whatever. And so we haven't decided on exactly how big some things are going to be, but we want to experiment with unit assets, like the graphical assets of units being somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5x bigger than, a Brood War version. And that's because we're going to be displaying to 1920 by 1080, like default 1080p res. And under those circumstances, we don't want the units to be so small that you lose out on character detail and individuality. Something that I always don't like about the Total Annihilation type games is that a lot of the time you just zoom out on a big map or whatever, and the units just become like triangles or other like shapes that indicate what kind of unit they are. And then you're just selecting these shapes and ordering them around. And it's like you lose all of what's interesting and compelling about an army to me when you do that. And so when we were playing with the old Onatar prototype back in the earlier stages of this year, something I did notice is that the Brood War scale assets felt very small, and to the point where they felt less significant, even though the stats were all the same for the most part. Like, obviously, there's some functional differences to how the units worked. We were doing bullets very differently, for example. But like, they felt less impactful on an individual basis because you could fit more of them on the screen. And it was like weird because I wouldn't think that would happen, but it definitely felt like that subconsciously. So one thing that we're experimenting with is, again, having that unit scale be larger. And so right now, the first worker is like the size of a phalanx or a siege tank or whatever in Brood War. And that kind of scale is actually pretty impactful because it means buildings also are going to end up being larger, right? In general, like a command center sized building will be occupying more build space if its asset is going to scale in the same way. So that'll be kind of interesting. I'm not sure how successful we'll end up being with that. That's definitely going to be a far-reaching change, like a change with far-reaching implications. But that's also something that's been developed lately as we try to figure out exactly what our scale is. That also could have, some ramifications for like cliff sizes, the terrain, grid size and stuff. We have to figure that out. It's definitely a change that is going to have some ramifications, but I'm very excited with it because
we are currently doing the what is it, 60 or 40? I think it's 60-degree angle terrain, but we might. I guess we might also experiment with like other angles or whatever.
We just need the angle that the terrain is rendered at just needs to allow for an output that works well with a tile. And so maybe the only thing we care about for a tile size is the terrain render, like what it finally turns into, right? Brood War has some really weird inconsistencies where there's a bunch of units that are just bugs where they were rendered with perspective on, which is really embarrassing. Besides that, the units are rendered at a different angle than buildings, and both of those are a different angle than terrain. So
terrain is close to units, I believe.
I don't remember what it is, but
different because it's
meant to basically make it so that you can easily tell.
Magic. One of them is magic isomango. I think that's terrain.
It has to be terrain so that it can tile correctly, yeah. But the main reason for the difference is so that you can instantly tell what a unit is, like subconsciously or whatever, relative to a terrain thing. But they also do some weird like desaturation shit at the post-processing level. Or not post-processing.
That might be
in the final step. Yeah,
but I think the angle thing might be also like if you look at a 3D game, it's usually not as readable as a 2D game, so that might be something that we have to be careful about, right?
Yeah. I mean, we're definitely gonna need to like figure that out, like part of it is gonna be like, oh, this is a new game with wholly new art, so there is gonna be adjustment to that, but we would like it to be as viscerally readable as a 2D RTS game usually is, right? Because it's a 2D RTS game, so why would it be less readable, right? So that's definitely something that we're gonna think about. But I feel like the assets being larger is also going to help with that too in some way, right? Like you'll be able to more immediately identify what a unit is if it's a bit bigger. Like that scale helps you actually.
Yeah.
So it might also encourage us to have higher detail meshes and textures, but hopefully we don't get excessive with that, even though we're like, it increases the workload or the bar that we have to hit for a high quality art asset because you can see more details on it. But hopefully we can still make it look good without it being like, oh shit, it's, not it's too readable, or it's not, whatever the case may be, right? Yeah. It's like, or not too readable. It's like too detailed to be instantly focused on or something. Cause that definitely happens with like the StarCraft remastered assets, for example. The Zergling looks completely different than its old silhouette. The Marine is very, very high detail as a model because it's supposed to be like 4K or whatever. But when it's at the Brood War scale, it's like all those details get crunched up and lost. So
I think it's really stupid how the Zergling was made, because for remaster they actually made it have hands, and it's because some old concept art had hands.
Yeah.
But why not establish consistency with their other game? I don't know. Like they definitely don't, like they just don't have it defined, like what is a Zergling. They haven't thought about it. It's just like, oh, we have this concept art.
Well, they also lost the original art assets, which is just like, that's a separate level of incompetence, really. I don't know how you can do that. I know it's back in the day when everything was on a CD or whatever, but still. At least that probably wouldn't happen now because you have like cloud backups somewhere, but it's still like ridiculous.
Well, I wish that Golden Disc wasn't.
Dude, I needed to get Overwatch, so I traded in the Golden Disc instead of publishing it somewhere else.
Yeah.
Obviously.
I mean, I understand that maybe he was like scared of the legal consequences or something. Just imagine how much greater we would have been if we had it.
Well, the silver lining that I always think about is if we had the source code for Brood War, maybe we would have not made Antikythera for a lot longer. So I'm not super worried. Like it does kind of, it does kind of piss me off in some ways, but also, it's probably fine. Probably fine. Yep. We're all good. I also should mention, since we talked about art assets, that Twardan, the main designer behind 5 Nations, another independent 2D RTS game, gave us permission to use his art assets if we find them useful or whatever. So obviously we will eventually have everything our own, but for an early prototype phase or whatever, since we do have legal permission to do that, it's very nice of him to offer that. We will probably end up using them at least for like building assets or something like that. So just as like a shortcut, you know what I mean?
And another cool thing is that DF just sent me code for extenders.
Hell yeah.
That is something that we have for our mod.
Yeah.
So we'll be able to finally play a high scale game, hopefully.
We can only hope once that's implemented. Yeah. It's definitely something that's really silly is like, obviously in Antikythera, we hope that, I guess we could talk about this as our final bit. We said before that we want to hit like really crazy high numbers of scale in our engine. We want like 500,000 units being able to run around or whatever, which is that's 500,000. That's a lot of units. And we don't want it to be total annihilation. Oh, look at my shapes on the minimap or whatever. Like, no, we want them to actually be able to be like, maybe not all on the screen together or whatever, but like that's a very crazy number. And we want to slowly build up there as we're like, building our earlier, smaller scale initial games. We want to build up to the big thing, right? Our magnum opus, as it were. And eventually we're going to hopefully get to some degree that's like that. But these earlier goals are like, maybe we can get 10,000 units, right? That's still more than most RTS games, and certainly more than Brood War, because Brood War has an in-game limit of 1,700. So, yeah, like, ideally, we will be able to reach some number like that, and these are more manageable goals that we can achieve without really worrying too much about, like, oh, it's not enough for what we need. Like, 10,000 is probably still excessive for what most games of our first game are going to be like. Most matches of our first game are going to be like. But the second, game might be more than that, or might actually need 10,000 or something, right? And so like we will build it up and we'll continue to improve the code base and like figure out what we did wrong or whatever. And the fact that, just like the design angle of like pushing the tech tree pacing and all this other stuff, and the interactions between the tech and stuff, just like that's going to get better, just like we're going to improve our process in that department, we're also going to do that on a technical level with the engine. So it's going to be really exciting. Like, honestly, I'm really glad to have obviously everybody who's in the community as part of this. also really glad to have you, Veek, as my right-hand homie.
Hi.
So it's going to be pretty epic to actually make, like, basically 2 guys and some other guys who are on the team and some other guys who are in the community. Like, some guys on the internet are going to revolutionize the RTS genre, which is kind of silly because we have no budget
cool.
and we're just enthusiasts basically, but we're still going to do a better job than like I still can't believe that we're actually going to make a StarCraft killer, like regardless of whether or not it's actually going to usurp it in popularity, just in terms of the quality of the game. Like, I don't know how good our marketing is going to be, but the quality of the game will actually be better. Like, that's shocking. Like, how is StarCraft still the glass ceiling of RTS games, right? Like, how is that still the best it can be right now? I don't know, man. That's crazy. So really looking forward to shattering that glass ceiling with you, dude.
Yeah, I'm looking forward as well.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me for this episode, and we appreciate the members of the community who are continuing to check us out on Instagram.
I'm very happy we have 3 episodes before year 2023.
There you go. That's
Happy New Year.
We're ringing in the 3 year with this episode.
Yeah.
So, of course, we'll do some more next year. Looking forward to seeing you guys soon. Peace.
Bye.